Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is the unit focus video on the Farseer Skyrunner. In these unit focus videos, I talk about what the unit is, its role on the table, obstacles to using it effectively, and how to play around those obstacles. Now, I'm particularly excited about the Farseer Skyrunner video for two reasons. One, I think that it's was a bit of a sleeper unit. People have figured it out. But in the first 5 months of the edition, nobody was really running this because there was so much other super shiny, frankly kind of overpowered stuff that was dominating competitive lists. And only now, since we've had some balanced data slate updates and some points updates and various options have been taken off the table, are we starting to get creative about the combos that are available with some of the other less obviously amazing units in the codex. This is a very good unit. It also, I like it because it makes a number of other units very viable in competitive play that kind of maybe aren't super viable without the combos provided by Guide, which is the principal power of the Farseer Skyrunner that lets you reroll hit rolls. I also I like those overlapping buffs and synergies, especially psychic buffs, because that's how Eldar have played historically. I missed that a little bit in the early months of 10th edition, where maybe we didn't have to lean into psychic buffs and stratagems quite as much as we have in earlier editions. But for me, that's just sort of aesthetically part of Eldar. So it's sort of nice to both be returning to that narrative element, but also being able to, because of the Farseer Skyrunner, use all of these other units that maybe I wasn't getting play out of before. The other reason that I'm excited about this is it's actually a sort of prequel to my unit on Wind Riders, my unit focus video, on Wind Riders, and in which I will also talk about how to make Samhan lists. I love thematic Eldari lists, and the Farseer Skyrunner is going to be a cornerstone of any such list. I currently have some lists with 2 Farseer Skyrunners, so I do think this is a competitive unit. I think it's highly viable for tournament play and also for casual play. And I think there's a lot of fun, interesting combos. So good times. Broadly speaking, its role on the table is to buff your other units, either with Guide, which I mentioned, or its Branching Fates ability. What Branching Fates lets you do is, you're familiar with this, I imagine, because you've been running Farseer, foot Farseers, right? Branching Fates lets you treat any fate die as a roll of 6 for a unit within 12 inches. Now, if you are running a foot Farseer, this is wonderful for your backfield units or your Avatar of Cain on turn 1, but it can be pretty difficult to reach your forward units with Branching Fates if you're running a foot Farseer. So one of the nice things about having a Farseer Skyrunner is it's easier to keep, for example, letting your Avatar automatically hit on Overwatch with sustained hits when it's out far enough in front of your foot Farseer that it's not really possible to provide that buff from the back line. And there are other ways in which you might want to use Fate Dice with forward units. I will just say that it's important to remember that you cannot use Branching Fates multiple times a turn, even if you have multiple Farseers. So this is not, if you already have a foot Farseer also in a list, this is not it's not like a big advantage to have this buff from the Farseer Skyrunner on turn 1. Later it can matter. Also, if you're not running the Avatar of Cain or a group of Wraithblades or something that just wants to stand out in line of sight and sort of take it and be durable, you don't absolutely need Fortune, in which case you can totally build lists that don't have foot Farseers, and in many of those lists, the Farseer Skyrunner does make a lot of sense. Okay, before I talk about the really important stuff, which is how to get the best synergy out of Guide, I'll just go over its stat line. So it is a 14-inch move, like all elves on bikes, and you can advance and still use Guide. That's nice. It's T4, like all elves on bikes. It has a 3-up natural save, like elves on bikes, at least Craftworld elves on bikes. It has a 4-up invuln because Farseer. That's nice. 5 wounds, not super durable, but we're elves. We don't expect to be. Leadership 6-up, typical. OC2, that's nice, right? Little extra OC. Nice to have. Its combat profile is frankly not bad, at least for shooting. It's also not the reason that you take the unit. It's not on its own worth 90 points, but it has Eldritch Storm, which used to be a psychic power. I mean, it's still a psychic power, but there's no psychic phase. It has 24 inches of range, D6 attacks with blast, so really nice into enemy infantry. big infantry blocks. Hits on 3s, strength 6, which is good, which means that it can also wound tanks that are less than T12 on 5 up, which matters. It's got -2 AP again, so it's got some bite into heavy infantry, but also it can ding a tank. And then D3 damage, having multi-damage, again, it means it's useful into a variety of targets. You know, it's not mind-blowing, but it's good. That's not insignificant. That's not an insignificant shooting weapon by any means. It's very good. You can give it the Singing Spear, or you can give it a Witchblade. If you give it a Witchblade, it's slightly better in melee. And if you give it the Singing Spear, it has an extra shooting attack that's decent. I always give it the Singing Spear. I think it's better, but not better enough that I would argue with you about it if you really want to use the Witchblade. But the Singing Spear in the shooting phase has a 12-inch range. It's got 1 attack. It has the assault keyword. It hits on 3s, strength 9. Ooh, that's cool, but no AP. So that's what's not cool. But then flat 3 damage. And I find that like 1 in every 2 or 3 games I play, my Singing Spear kills a Terminator when they flub the roll, or it does 3 damage to a tank that fails a save. It's not nothing. And 3 damage is just enough to kind of really suck when it goes through. And then you can also fire your twin-linked Shuriken Catapult. Altogether, between the Singing Spear, the Shuriken Catapult, and Eldritch Storm, that's a solid little chunk of shooting. It's not nothing. It's not the reason you take the unit, but it's definitely not nothing. That is a meaningful combination to combat, especially if you're running this in a squad of Wind Riders, which have Shuriken Cannons. Then the range on Eldritch Storm is the same as the range on the Shuriken Cannons, and that's a nice little fire boost. In melee, if it has the Singing Spear, it's got 2 attacks hitting on 2s, only strength 3, not great, and with no AP, but again, flat 3 damage. So if you get lucky with the wound roll and your opponent flubs the armor save, that's a big chunk of damage. And then alternatively, if it has a Witchblade, it has 2 attacks hitting on 2s with anti-infantry 2, which is really good, but again, no AP, and then only flat 2 damage instead of flat 3. So not a melee unit, but every now and then it can get really lucky in melee. Okay, let's talk about the interesting, important stuff. So what's interesting and important about the Farseer Skyrunner is that it has guide. And this is an old school Eldari psychic power that lets you reroll hit rolls for a unit. That's still what it does, but the mechanics have changed since earlier editions because no psychic phase. So in your command phase, which is significant because it means you have to do this before you've moved the model, you roll a d6, and onto 2+, you select a friendly Eldari unit within 12 inches. And until the start of your next command phase, each time a model in that unit makes an attack, you reroll the hit roll. This is important because it applies both in shooting and melee. It's also important that it applies during your opponent's turn for purposes of Overwatch, or also for melee. The Overwatch thing actually is quite significant. Now, the way a newer player might be tempted to use guide would be to simply throw it on something with a lot of shooting attacks that are pretty powerful. Shooting attacks, like say a Falcon, right? A Falcon has probably a Bright Lance, 1 shot, a Pulse Laser, I think 3 more shots on the Pulse Laser, good shooting, and then a Shuriken Cannon, 3 shots with sustained hits. That's not a bad little package, and it's enough shots that our detachment reroll alone, one reroll to hit, is probably not going to make up for all the times that you miss. But if you are taking the Farseer Skyrunner to routinely use guide on your Falcon, you are not using it to its maximum effect. There are some very powerful combos available with this model that open up some pretty cool Eldari trickery, and generally they involve units. In my opinion, they pretty much exclusively involve units that have either sustained hits or lethal hits, but especially sustained hits, or units that are artificially getting access to lethal hits via Shroud Runners, which is a really fun combo. Again, especially if you're running a Samhan bike list. I'll talk about that in the Samhan video, but a little bit here. Units that just natively have sustained hits and also volume of fire. This only really matters for units with volume of fire. Like the Avatar of Cain has sustained hits, but he has 1 shot with the Wailing Doom, and you have a native reroll for the detachment ability anyway, so you're never going to put guide on the Avatar for the purposes of shooting anyway. But units with high volume of fire, like a big block of Wind Riders or a big unit of 10 Swooping Hawks led by Bahareth, I made a video about that relatively recently. That's actually a pretty solid combo. Or a group of Dire Avengers, which have lethal hits in this edition, like a big group. Striking Scorpions can be bizarrely effectively buffed for reasons we'll get to. The Vizark can have sustained hits. Leading Harlequins, they don't have it naturally, but there are a number of options. And then, as I mentioned, you can give something access to lethal hits with Shroud Runners. So those are kind of the obvious combo units for the Farseer Skyrunner, and this is how the combo actually works. So let's say you have a Farseer Skyrunner leading like 9 Wind Riders. Wind Riders should be equipped with Shuriken Cannons. There really isn't another competitive pick. There's like a way to use the scatter lasers, but generally you want the Shuriken Cannons. So each of those Shuriken Cannons has 3 shots. So 9 of them will put out 27 shots. And the Farseer Skyrunner, if he's also part of the unit, or she is also part of the unit, and generally I think that's what you want to do, can also make rerolls for Eldritch Storm. But the move for the sustained hits is you start by rolling 27 dice and rerolling everything that's not a 6. So it doesn't matter if you hit, you pick those dice up and re-roll them anyway. People who play this game in 9th edition and were competitive are probably familiar with this tactic from this Blade Storm trick we used to do back when Blade Storm meant something different with Dire Avengers. But this is a big deal. If you roll 27 dice, you're going to get some 6s generally. It's reasonable to hope that you would get 5 6s. So you just set those aside, and you pick up the other 21 dice and you roll them again, and maybe you get 4 more 6s, plus you hit a bunch of times. And so between those two, the roll and the reroll, you have 9 6s, but with sustained hits 1, that's 18 hits, plus the other hits that you got. You should end up hitting almost as many times as you fired. And then you rolled a wound, and even if, right, you're targeting something that's just a little bit too tough for the Shuriken Cannons and they're wounding it on 5s, you just have volume of fire such that you're going to push through a bunch of multi-wound damage, which is great. And if it's into something like infantry, or ideally heavy infantry, you're really, really going to mess it up. Now, that's cool, but where the trick gets particularly awesome is then on your opponent's turn, if your bikes are still hanging out in a place where potentially they could be targeted. And one of the issues with bikes is that they are fragile. And when I make my unit focus video on bikes, on Windrunners, and on Samhan lists in general, I will talk about how and when and why you may want to fire and fade with big units of Wind Riders. Generally, if you're investing in a big unit, it really makes sense. But if you do have the bikes hanging out there, the opportunity to fire Overwatch with them when they're guided, you're going to hit. So on average, you'll hit 18 times with Overwatch, which is awesome, because on average, you'll hit 5 times and then you reroll everything that's not a 6. You're only hitting on 6s anyway. You end up with around 9 hits, and then they're sustained hits, so you double it. So that's really powerful. I played a tournament game recently in which, in a mirror match, I wiped a bike squad with this. Like, we both had a bike squad on one flank, and it was like this cat and mouse game. And then my bike squad popped out, and the Overwatch, it'll totally pop something kind of like equivalent to that unit, which is great. And if you're also running a Warlock with the bike squad, being able to ignore cover, right? That's almost like another AP in the current edition. That's a big deal too. I really think this generally is at its best with sustained hits, but it's also really good with lethal hits. So a unit of Swooping Hawks, for example, if you are running the 10 Hawk combo with Bahareth, and the advantage to doing that is that the Hawks get like Shadow Specters, they get like a free battle focus move. So they pop out, they've got pretty good movement, they shoot, and then they can move totally out of line of sight. They have reasonably decent range. That unit puts out, not even including Bahareth's pretty okay shooting, 40 shots with lethal hits. So if you start by, they can shoot like a tank. And if you start, I mean, if there's infantry to target, by all means, wipe the infantry. But the nice thing here is that like there's always a target that they can do some damage to. It doesn't matter what kind of matchup it is. It doesn't matter if you're playing a Horde army or Imperial Knights or like a Space Marine Horde or whatever. With lethal hits, volume of fire always poses some kind of a threat. You probably don't want to target something with a 2-up save with something with no AP, but anything else is vulnerable to some damage because you roll 40 dice. Well, on average, you should get 6 point something sixes, and then you pick up everything that's not a 6, and you re-roll those dice. And this is not even including Baharoth himself. So it's really going to be like 7, and then you pick up everything that's not a 6, and you do it again, and you get like 5 or 6, and you start with, right out of the gate, 11 or 12 auto wounds, some of which may have like AP and multi-damage because Baharoth's weapon. And then you've got some other hits that maybe just like also wounded natively. So you get your first round of shooting of lethal hits, your second round of shooting of lethal hits, and then when you roll a wound, you roll some wounds. And the result is you end up pushing through like, I don't know, 15 wounds or whatever on some unit. So even this unit that is fabulous anti-infantry fire that can just wipe infantry units, that also has the grenade keyword, that also has a Phoenix Lord so it can charge into melee and do some damage. And you can give the power sword to the Swooping Hawk Exarch too. So it can be like a finishing melee threat. In addition, it can put, 5 or 6 wounds on a tank, which is, what you would do if you got through with a Bright Lance probably also. So that's pretty good. And again, having the flexibility such that these units that are incredibly good at anti-infantry, they're fast, so they're incredibly good at scoring. They're easy to keep alive because move and shoot, or like with a big unit of bikes, a fast fire and fade. Guy just gives them the versatility to kind of do anything. They're both, they're a scoring unit, but they're also a killing unit in any list into anything. Similarly, a big unit of Dire Avengers, like 10 Dire Avengers coming out of reserve on some flank. Dire Avengers are pretty cheap in this edition. I want to say 10, I think that's 140 currently. That's not really bad. And if they're putting out 30 shots with lethal hits and you start by re-rolling everything that's not a 6 to get a bunch of 6s and then actually rolling to wound, and all of those have -1 AP, and then also potentially can re-roll for Overwatch again with lethal hits. That's a pretty good tool coming in on flank. Nobody's running Dire Avengers right now. I'm not telling you you should do this, but I am going to experiment with it. And I think that if you have Guide in a list, it's certainly not the worst. It's certainly good enough for casual play. Absolutely it is. Striking Scorpions are another one, actually. If you give the Exarch the Biting Blade, it's got 5 attacks. If you give it the Scorpion Claw, it's got 4. Either way, all the Scorpions have sustained hits. The regular Scorpion Chainswords are putting out 4 attacks, and then the Exarch has this better weapon that's either 5 or 4. So you've got this unit putting out 20, 21 attacks with sustained hits 1. Well, if you start by just re-rolling everything that's not a 6, you're going to hit a ton of times. You should end up with like 6 sustained hits, so that's like 12, plus others that are starting forward of your army to kind of like frenzy and go nuts, is like the ability to fish for dev wounds when they're coming out of a Falcon. It's the same skill, it's the same tactic. It really does max their damage output in fun ways. And if you want to run Scorpions because they're only 65 points now, this is a good way to get a little extra something out of them. I have not personally been finding that the Scorpions end up being my ideal target in these lists, but it's certainly an option, and I know that some other people who are more Scorpion-centric have had some luck with this. The other interesting combo that exists potentially here is with Shroud Runners, because Shroud Runners have the ability to pick a unit that's visible to them within 12 inches and give everything in your army lethal hits against that target by like marking it, which is really cool. And this just opens up some interesting combos. So for example, if you were running a big unit of Dark Reapers are suddenly getting kind of popular. If you're running a big unit of Dark Reapers, one of the things that they struggle with is that even though they have these like missile launchers, they don't really have high enough strength or quite enough volume of fire on their own to be effective into targets that are harder than like very light vehicles and modestly heavy infantry like regular Space Marines. But if you start with getting lethal hits on 6s and you reroll everything that's not a 6, with Guide, they have okay AP. Actually, that's pretty decent. And then you can always phantasm with them back through a wall. And also, it's nice if you throw Guide on the Reapers. That's also really good for the Tempest Launcher. And again, it's like in the late game, when you're running out of tools, if you do still have a unit of Shroud Runners and your Farseer Skyrunner, the ability to like pick something and give it rerolls and give everything lethal hits and choose the thing with the highest volume of fire and like give it rerolls into the thing is not bad. And again, do not forget the Overwatch trick, right? Hitting on 6s, not great. Hitting on 6s, but with volume of fire, but re-rolling all your dice for more 6s and getting sustained hits, woo, or lethal hits, not bad. Actually makes Overwatch pretty dangerous, and you're not burning up a fate die for it. It's not like the Avatar Overwatch, right, or the Bright Lance trick. That's a really powerful combo. And then obviously units that have some sort of hybrid melee shooting. You've got to remember Guide also works in melee, as I was mentioned with the Striking Scorpions. They certainly don't have great shooting, but it's worth remembering. I actually think if you were running that big block of Harlequins with the Visarch, this can matter because that big block of Harlequins can have some pretty decent little pistols and some decent melee. And obviously the ability to fish for crazy sustained hits with the Visarch matters too. So there are lots of tricky, cool options here. And a lot of these options involve making units that have not up to now been big time damage dealers, pretty effective damage dealers into a variety of types of target. And that's really cool. Okay, let's talk being a leader. So the Farseer Skyrunner, as I already mentioned, can lead jet bikes. Jet bikes either come in 3 and 6 or in 9. I think that there are arguments for all of these squad sizes. I am having fun with like the big unit of bikes. I will say, and when I do my unit focus video on Wind Riders, I'll mention this again. If you are doing the big unit of bikes, I kind of think you probably do want at least one unit of Shroud Runners. So in matchups where your opponent just doesn't have anything that's an ideal target for bikes, like when you're up against Knights, the ability to get both sustained hits and lethal hits with the bikes makes them versatile in the way that you need them to be for tournament play and to all comers. I think if you're running a smaller squad of bikes, like 6 or 3, it's kind of less essential that they have the ability to be damage dealers in any matchup. But bikes with shuriken cannons are a great option for this unit. Even if you were going to run bikes with scatter lasers, the real advantage to the scatter laser is the 36-inch range and the ability to hang back. And then the Farseer Skyrunner is not using her attacks, and she's not out in front being able to use branching fates on forward units. I really think there's no question that it's the shuriken cannons. And if you're running her with bikes, that's going to be the build. If you're only running 3, probably they're a little bit more like ablative wounds, and they're only a combat unit in the late game. The other reason I like the bigger bike units is generally if you're going to go through the expense and effort of having the Farseer Skyrunner and having the big bike mob, you want to use Fire and Fade, and you want to be using Fire and Fade on a big hard-hitting tool, not on a Farseer with 3 bikes. That just doesn't make sense. And if you don't Fire and Fade it, it's hard to keep it alive. But if you're going to Fire and Fade it, then probably you should have invested more in it. Now, the other option is a Warlock Conclave. either 2 bikes at 100 points or 3 bikes at 150. I think 2 or even 3 bikes in casual play is kind of like a fun pick. And then you have this neat little psychic combat unit that the warlocks have 2 or 3 d6 torrent attacks with strength 5 -1 AP flamer, psychic flamers essentially, and they're -1 to wound, which is like trivially inconvenient because then your opponent has to target them with something that's more than strength 4, I guess, or not, but high volume of fire. That's because of an ability the warlocks have. Generally, though, in more competitive play, I'm not totally sold on the warlocks for the simple reason that the cheapest version of the unit, 100 points, is such that you could just get a second Farseer Skyrunner. So, like, you don't need them to keep it alive because you could just have another one and then you could be casting Guide twice until one dies. I don't know. I'm not, for fewer points. I kind of wish the Witchblades in this edition just had a little bit of AP. So if you ran 3 of these things and you gave the Farseer Skyrunner a Witchblade 2, they could have like pretty good shooting and pretty good melee and be like a fun little psychic combat unit. I think as the rules stand pre 10th edition Codex, at the current cost, it doesn't really make sense. But if you really need to do it for emotional reasons or because you're playing Oathway or something, it's not the worst. Your last option, of course, would be to run a Farseer Skyrunner just on its own. I don't think this is terrible. For one thing, you don't need line of sight for guide. So you just have to get the Skyrunner within 12 inches of the thing that you want to put guide on, and you keep it out of line of sight, and you guide stuff. And then in the late game, maybe it comes out and starts Eldritch storming some stuff. You just need to be a little bit careful about enemy units that are faster than anticipated or can advance and charge through walls and whatnot. I think that's fine. I think the best reason to use the Farseer Skyrunner with bikes is that, frankly, a big unit of Wind Riders is one of the units that has the best synergy with the guide ability. And at that point, you might as well just put the Farseer in there and get the extra shooting and always have it in range and be able to fire and fade with the whole kit and caboodle. But if you have other units you're planning to buff, I think it is certainly reasonable to run it alone. As for obstacles to using it effectively, honestly, I think I've sort of already touched on them. It's fragile, and its probable escort unit bikes are fragile. And if you run it with a couple of warlocks, they have a 4-up invul and they can be -1 to wound, but frankly, they're pretty fragile. So you just have to be careful. I mean, the best tool is fire and fade. I guess the other thing to consider is snipers, right? You could give it the Phoenix Gem for 35 points. I guess the ability to resurrect a fast character on a bike, especially in the late game, could flip a key objective on a 2-up. I guess if you're an advanced player and you wanted to mess around with that as an option, it could be kind of cool. But I'm not sold on the notion that it's necessarily worth the points. I think I would be more likely to accept that if there are snipers, it needs to keep its head down. And frankly, even if they're not snipers and it has an escort unit, generally it needs to keep its head down or plan to obliterate whatever thing can get with an angle on the bikes or whatever it is with that souped up guided sustained hits Overwatch fire. So that's what I've got on the Farseer Skyrunner. And frankly, I've also already mentioned the majority of my play strategies for at least large units of Wind Riders. I hope to be back again soon with a slightly longer video on strategies for playing Sam Han or just generally bike-themed lists. One of these did really well at a GT recently, which I'm excited about. It even included some Shining Spears. Ooh. So I'm looking forward to going down that rabbit hole with you in the near future. In the meantime, if you have your own ideas about how to use the Farseer Skyrunner effectively, I hope you will leave those in the comments below. If you just want to say, hello, algorithm, you could say, hello, algorithm, or hello, Brent. Last time I invited people to tell me the names of their pets, and no one did. I didn't take it hard, but nevertheless, now's your chance. to right that wrong. If you've not subscribed, I hope you'll subscribe. If you haven't liked the video, I hope that you will like the video. And thank you, new patrons who showed up after last video. You guys are great. I'm always looking for more. So if you'd like to become a patron and join the Discord, that would also be cool. Okay, take care. Back again soon. Best of luck with your zippy bike riding pointy ears. Bye.